The Ferrari 488 GTB sat dead in the middle of the Aldridge showroom floor, Rosso Corsa paint catching the overhead lights like fresh blood on glass. Three mechanics in pressed gray uniforms stood around it, hands at their sides, saying nothing. Sloane Aldridge crossed the polished epoxy in heels that struck the floor like a metronome and threw the diagnostic folder onto the hood. When the side door opened and a man in a faded flannel walked in, oil still under his nails, a small girl gripping his hand and clutching a sketchbook, Sloane turned. She looked him up and down once. "Get out of here, you useless thing. We don't need a small-town grease monkey." The girl tightened her grip. Holden only nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Then he turned and walked out. The drive back to Asheville took a little over 2 hours on the parkway, the Ford F-50 rumbling steady through the long curves where the maples had already started to burn. Ivy sat in the passenger seat with her sketchbook open on her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She was watching the side of her father's face. "Daddy, why did she say that?" Holden kept both hands on the wheel. He waited until the road straightened before he answered. "Sometimes people hurt somewhere inside, Ivy. And when they hurt long enough, the hurt starts coming out of their voice. It isn't really meant for you. It's just the only door it knows." Ivy thought about that for a long time. The truck climbed a grade, and on the other side, the valley opened up the way it always did in October, brown and gold and a kind of orange that didn't have a real name. "I don't think she liked my drawings," Ivy said. "She didn't see them, sweetheart. She would have, if she looked." He didn't answer that one. He just reached across and put his hand over the small one on her knee. They drove the rest of the way in the kind of silence that wasn't really silence. Only two people who didn't need to fill the air to know they were both still there. They pulled into Asheville a little after 4. The garage sign said Vance Auto Works in white letters on a green field, and the paint had gone soft at the edges from too many summers. Across the street, the bell over the door of Marge's corner gave its tin little chime when they walked in. Marge Holloway was 64 years old, with hair the color of brushed steel and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had a way of looking at a person like she'd already figured out what was wrong and was just waiting for them to catch up. She poured Ivy a cup of hot chocolate without being asked. Then she put her hand on Holden's wrist as he reached for his wallet. "Don't bother. I miscounted last month's rent. Found the difference yesterday." She slid an envelope across the counter into the side pocket of his jacket. "Just take it. Save us both the argument." Holden looked at her. Then he took the envelope out and laid it flat on the counter between them. "Marge, Holden, I know what last month was. I know what this month is. And I know what you cleared on coffee in October." He pushed the envelope back toward her. "Keep it. I'll figure it." She didn't argue. She only sighed and put it back under the register. But her eyes followed him out the door, and she watched him cross the street to the dark garage, and she watched the light come on inside the bay, and she stayed at the window longer than she needed to, the rag in her hand forgotten. That night, after Ivy was asleep upstairs, Holden sat on the stool at his workbench in the empty bay. The fluorescence hummed. He pulled open the bottom drawer, the one he hadn't opened in 2 years, and took out a small metal badge no bigger than a silver dollar. Maranello, it said. Powertrain Division. The enamel had worn at the edges where his thumb used to rub it on long flights home. He held it for a moment in the flat of his palm. Then he set it back in the drawer and closed it slow. 3 days later, on the 18th floor of the Aldridge Tower in Charlotte, Trent Kessler stood at the head of the conference table with a tablet in his hand and a careful, sympathetic expression on his face. 45 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of man who learned early that confidence sounded like patience. "The Whitfield car," he said. 488 GTB, promised delivery by Friday. We've had 3 authorized shops on it. 4 master techs total. Nobody can read what the ECU is throwing. Codes aren't in the manual." He set the tablet down. "I think we have to send it back to Italy. 6 weeks, minimum." Sloane sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded, her face giving him nothing. "Whitfield is the introduction to the regional distribution deal. I'm aware. If the car isn't running by Friday, the deal goes to Mercer in Atlanta. I'm aware." She let the silence sit on him. Trent let it sit on her right back. He was good at that. He had practiced it on her father for 20 years before he had ever practiced it on her. "There is one option," he said, with the smallest of smiles. Long shot. There's a guy in Asheville, independent, used to be in the trade, supposedly. The only person inside 300 miles who'll touch a Ferrari ECU without an authorization sticker. Who? His shop is called Vance Auto Works. Holden Vance. Sloane didn't move for a long moment. The name came back to her in pieces. The flannel, the little girl, her own voice in her own ears, in her own showroom, saying the words she had said. She did not let any of it onto her face. "Get me a tow truck," she said. She didn't see Trent's expression when she said it. She didn't see the way his face didn't change, but the muscle along his jaw did. She didn't see him, an hour later, in his own office, place a call to a number in South Carolina and say into the receiver, very softly, "We may have a problem, and we may have a chance." That same afternoon, in Asheville, Ivy came down the stairs to the garage holding a sheet of paper. On it, she had drawn the red Ferrari, careful as she could, every panel line in the right place. She had even shaded the underside of the body in a darker red, the way she had seen her father shade things in his old technical sketches. Beside the car, she had drawn a tall, thin woman with yellow hair and a mouth that turned down at the corners. She held it up to her father. "Who's that?" he asked, even though he knew. "The lady from the showroom." He looked at it for a long time. Then he took it across the bay and pinned it to the wall, next to a small framed photograph of a woman with the same color hair, smiling under a Tuscan pine. Helena. The two faces hung side by side, one drawn by a child in October, one taken by a husband in another country, in another life. Ivy stood beside him and studied her own picture. "Daddy, does she ever smile?" He didn't answer. He put his hand on the top of her head, and they stood there for a while, looking at the wall, neither of them in any hurry to be anywhere else. Saturday morning, just past 9, the bell on Marge's door hadn't even finished ringing when the air brake of a flatbed wrecker hissed across the street. Holden was in the bay with a rag in his back pocket and Ivy on a stool beside him, eating a biscuit. He heard the hiss and walked out into the sunlight, wiping his hands on a clean square of shop towel. The Ferrari sat strapped on the bed in its blanket, low and red and absurd against the brick storefronts of Asheville. The driver of the wrecker was a man Holden, recognized from a long-haul job out of Greensboro 3 years back. The driver lifted his cap, said only, "Ma'am paid in advance for the round trip," and started loosening the chains. And down out of the cab of the second vehicle, a black SUV that had pulled up behind, stepped Sloane Aldridge. She was not in a suit. She wore a gray cardigan and dark jeans and flat brown shoes, and her hair was down. Without the heels, she was shorter than he'd remembered, and her eyes had the kind of red rim that comes from a long drive at first light without enough coffee. She did not say good morning. She walked into the bay, set a thick envelope on his workbench, and unfolded the top so he could see the corners of the bills. 5,000, cash. Just look at it. If you can't, I'll take it back and we never talk. Holden didn't touch the envelope. He looked past her at the car on the bed. Then he looked at her hands. They were shaking very slightly. She noticed him noticing and put them in her cardigan pockets. Behind him, light footsteps. Ivy had come up to the open bay door. She saw Sloane, recognized her instantly, and ducked behind her father's leg without a word. Sloane saw the child, and for a beat, just a beat, her face did something it did not know how to do. She looked, for that 1 second, like a person who had remembered she was a person. "I'll look at it," Holden said. "Keep your money on you until I know whether I can do anything. If I can't, you owe me nothing. If I can, we'll talk about a fair number then." Sloane started to argue. She was a woman who argued by reflex, but just as she opened her mouth, Marge crossed the street with a coffee pot in her hand, glanced into the bay, and stopped walking entirely. She stared at Sloane, not at the cardigan, at the face, at the line of the jaw. Her mouth opened a 1/4 inch, then closed. Marge said nothing. She turned around and went back across the street, the coffee pot still in her hand. Sloane watched her go. "Who was that?" "Marge," Holden said. "Owns the diner." She looked at me like she knew me. Maybe she did. Sloane let it pass. But something in her shoulders had shifted. The way a person stands when they suddenly remember they grew up somewhere a long time ago, in a place they have not let themselves think about, and somebody from that place has just walked back into view. Holden popped the engine cover. The 8-cylinder twin-turbo nestled under the glass, immaculate, beautiful, dead. He stood looking at it for a long moment with his hands at his sides. The way a man looks at the body of someone he used to know. Sloane saw the look and didn't understand it. She would not understand it for another 2 days. He pulled a battered aluminum case from under the bench, scratched and dented, an antenna lolling sideways from the lid. His diagnostic rig. Sloane saw it and let out a small, dry laugh she immediately regretted. He didn't react. He plugged in, powered up, and pulled a stool over. Ivy crawled up onto a second stool to watch, the heels of her sneakers tapping the rung in a slow rhythm. For 15 minutes there was no sound but the soft chirp of the rig and the tap of Holden's finger against the screen. Sloane stood with her arms crossed and tried to look like she was watching the street. She was not. She was watching his hands. They were clean despite the grease. They moved without any wasted motion, the way the hands of a surgeon move, or the hands of a pianist who has been playing the same piece for 30 years. Once he muttered something in Italian under his breath, so quiet she almost missed it. Her head turned a quarter inch. He did not notice. Then he leaned back. "You've got 3 problems," he said. None of them showed on Factory, because Factory wasn't looking in the right place. The secondary knock sensor on cylinder 6 is throwing noise. The right bank turbo bypass valve is sticking about half a millisecond on the close. Either of those alone, you'd live with. But the third one's the killer. Your ECU firmware has been reflashed. It's not Maranello code. Somebody overwrote it. The color went out of Sloane's face from the brow down. Reflashed. "Yes, ma'am." "By who?" "Signatures on the file. I'll pull it for you." Her hand went to the edge of the workbench. She steadied herself for half a second, and then took the hand away, as if it had betrayed her by being there. Trent. Trent signed every VIP service approval. Trent had sat across from her 3 days ago and said, "Send it to Italy." The whole thing rearranged itself behind her eyes in 2 seconds, the way a Rubik's Cube falls into solution when somebody who knows what they're doing finally takes it out of your hand. Ivy slid off her stool, walked into the back, and came out with a paper cup of water. She held it up to Sloane with both hands, the way a small child holds something they don't want to spill. Sloane took it. She looked at the child. She said, "Thank you." It was the first time in a long time she had said those 2 words to anyone and meant the whole of them. Ivy looked up at her with absolute seriousness. "Do you still hate my daddy?" Sloane couldn't answer. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. She crouched down a little, awkward in her flats, so she was closer to Ivy's eye level, but she still couldn't find the words. She shook her head once. Very small. "Ivy," Holden said gently, from across the bay. "Inside, sweetheart, let me work." Ivy went. At the door she turned and looked at Sloane one more time, and then she was gone up the stairs. Holden plugged a cable into the secondary diagnostic port and pulled the operations log out of the ECU. He ran the file through a small program he had written himself years ago on a flight back from Modena, when the only thing he could do to keep from thinking about his wife was write code. He printed 2 pages on the old laser by the window and walked them over to Sloane without comment. She read. She read again. She put a finger on a line halfway down the second page and held it there. "Crestline Performance," she said. "South Carolina. Not on any factory subcontractor list I've ever seen." She stepped out of the bay. The maples on the sidewalk had turned the color of a struck match, and the light coming through them painted the back of her cardigan red. She took her phone out and called her assistant in Charlotte and said, very calmly, "Pull every payment we've made to a vendor called Crestline Performance. Every one. I want the invoices, the approvals, and the signatures. Now." Then she called a second number, the lawyer, the personal one, not the corporate one. She spoke for 2 minutes in a voice that did not break. She said the words federal exposure once. She said the word betrayal not at all. When she came back into the bay, her eyes had not gotten wet. But there was a small thing inside her face that had cracked, the way a windshield cracks before it falls. The bell on Marge's door chimed across the street. Marge crossed the road carrying a covered plate. She came into the bay without asking, set the plate down on the workbench beside the envelope of cash, and lifted the cloth. Cornbread. Still warm. with a pat of butter melting into the top crack. "Eat," she said to Sloane. Sloane stared at her. "Your father stood under that maple in 1986, Marge said. "Right where you just stood. I had walked over from his old shop on Tunnel Road to tell him his first bookkeeper was stealing from him. He didn't cry either, but he ate every piece of cornbread I put in front of him, and he hired a new bookkeeper on Monday." She paused. "You probably don't remember me. You were 3. You sat on the floor of his office and colored on the back of invoices. You used to say the word maple wrong. You said maypole. He used to laugh every time and pretend he was correcting you, and he never did correct you because he liked the sound of it too much." Sloane looked at her hard, and somewhere behind Sloane's eyes, a voice she had not heard in 30 years said, "Careful, sweetheart, that pen has ink." Her father's voice, with all its old warmth, before the disease had taken even the shape of it away. She took the cornbread. She ate it standing up. Holden, across the bay, did not look at either of them. He pretended to read a torque spec he already knew by heart. After a moment, he glanced up. Sloane was crying without crying, the way some people do, with no sound and no movement, and only the slow change of the skin around her eyes to give it away. Marge was looking at her the way a woman looks at a daughter she did not know she still had. Sloane did not drive back to Charlotte that night. She told her assistant to cancel her Monday morning and booked a room at a motel called the Pinecrest on the edge of Asheville, 2 miles from the garage. She slept poorly. She did not call her father's nurse. She lay on her back in the dark and tried to remember the smell of her father's old shop on Tunnel Road, and could not, and then suddenly could, all at once, the way a song you forgot comes back when somebody hums one bar. At 6 in the morning, she walked into Marge's, ordered 2 coffees to go, and crossed the street. Holden's bay door was already up. He had been there since 5. She set 1 coffee on the workbench beside him. He nodded thanks without looking up. He was elbow-deep in the right bank turbo housing. She wandered the bay while he worked. She had not been inside an independent garage since she was a teenager, and there was something about the smell of clean engine oil and old coffee that she had forgotten she missed. On the back wall, behind the workbench, were the photographs. Helena, smiling under the pine. Ivy at maybe 4, on a beach, holding a starfish. And, in a smaller frame, lower down where you'd only see it if you were looking, a younger Holden in a gray uniform, standing in front of a half-assembled Vate, with Italian script on the wall behind him. Powertrain Reparto Course. Sloane stood very still in front of that photograph. She stood there for almost a full minute. "Were you?" she said, at Maranello. Holden didn't look up from the turbo. "For a while. Before my wife died." "How long?" 7 years. 2012 to 2019. "Doing what?" "Lead engineer on the 8-cylinder twin-turbo program. The engine that's in the car on your hood right now." Sloane stood with her coffee halfway to her mouth and did not lower it. The cup hung there in the air. After a moment, she set it down on the bench, very carefully, so it would not make a sound. Her mind ran very fast and very quiet through everything she had said to him in the showroom, every adjective, every degree of contempt in her own voice, and laid it all next to the photograph on the wall and tried to make those 2 things fit together. They did not fit. They would not fit for a long time. A small voice from the stairs said, "She's looking at the picture." Ivy patted down in pajamas and slippers, clutching her sketchbook. Without ceremony, she walked over and put the sketchbook in Sloane's lap as Sloane sat down on the stool. Sloane held it like a person holds something breakable. "Open it," Ivy said. She opened it. Page after page of engine drawings, not the way a child draws an engine, cylinder layouts, intake runners, a rough but accurate cutaway of a turbocharger with a child's careful printing beside it. "Daddy says this one is called the wastegate." 2 pages later, "This is the camshaft, and it has lobes." On another page, a drawing of a small girl in a flannel shirt holding a wrench, captioned, "Me when I am big." Sloane laughed. It was a small laugh, almost an apology, and it was the first time in a long time that anyone outside her own family had heard her do it. Holden, across the bay, heard it too. He set the wrench down for half a second longer than he needed to. Then he picked it back up. He worked the rest of the morning in quiet. At noon, he came out from under the car, wiped his hands, and said to her, 48 hours. From right now, if I have the bypass valve in my hand by tonight, I can have the engine running by Monday morning. What do you need? Original part, not aftermarket. There's a supplier in Atlanta who keeps 3 on the shelf. They'd have to ship overnight. She had her phone out before he finished the sentence. 3 minutes later, she said, "It'll be at your door at 6 tomorrow morning." He nodded. "Thank you. You don't have to thank me. It's my car. I wasn't thanking you for the part." She didn't ask what he was thanking her for. She thought she might know. They sat on the front step of the garage in the late afternoon, their backs against the open bay door, eating Marge's cornbread out of waxed paper. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and the street had emptied out the way Asheville streets do on Sundays. A single dog walked itself down the far sidewalk, sniffed at a parking meter, and moved on. Ivy was upstairs with a book. Sloan spoke without looking at him. "My father has Parkinson's. Late stage. 8 months ago, he could still sign his name. Now he can't hold the pen. He used to read me bedtime stories until I was 12, even after I was old enough to read them myself, because we both pretended the other one needed it. I took the company over in March. Trent is the only person he ever fully trusted when his mind was still his own. So when Trent tells me something, part of me still hears my father's voice agreeing. That's how he got away with it. Not because I was stupid, because I missed my father." She stopped. Then, quieter. "I don't know why I'm telling you that. I'm sorry. I've said too much." "You haven't," Holden said. She glanced at him. "You haven't said too much. You said exactly enough. Most people don't. Most people say half and leave the other half in their throat for years." He chewed his cornbread for a long moment before he went on. He looked out at the maple across the street, at the way the wind was turning the leaves over to show their pale undersides. "Helena died of a stroke at 31, he said. "I was in Italy. I was on a flight by the time she got to the hospital, but I wasn't there when she went." Ivy was 18 months old. Helena's mother held her on the airport bench while they waited for me. After that, I couldn't hear a vate start without feeling sick to my stomach. Took me 2 years to open this place. I worked Fords, Chevys, Toyotas, nothing with a Ferrari badge on it. Until your tow truck pulled up yesterday. Why did you take the job then? He thought about that for a long time before he answered. Because the second I saw your face when you said, "Get out of here," I knew you weren't seeing me. You were seeing somebody you needed to push past so you could get to whatever was actually scaring you. I've worn that face. I wore it for 2 years after Helena. You don't get out of it on your own. Sloan turned her head. He turned his. They looked at each other for longer than 3 seconds. Neither of them said anything else. The light on the maple changed by degrees. After a while, Marge appeared in the diner window across the street and saw the 2 of them sitting there on the step and did not come out and did not turn the open sign over to closed even though it was past her closing time. The Atlanta part arrived at 5:58 Monday morning. Holden was already at the bench, second cup of coffee gone cold beside him. Ivy had insisted on coming down with her blanket, and she sat in a folding camp chair with a pencil in her hand and her head on her own shoulder, asleep before he had the box open. He worked through the small hours of dawn, bypass valve in, knock sensor replaced, ECU cabled to the laptop. He pulled a thumb drive from his shirt pocket, the original Maranello firmware, signed and time-stamped. He had been allowed to keep his own development copies under the terms of his old contract. He had not used the drive in 6 years, and he had been a little afraid, when he plugged it in, that the file would be corrupted or that he would have forgotten the passphrase. Neither was true. The file came up clean. The passphrase came back to him on the second try because it was the date he and Helena had been married. He uploaded. He calibrated. He ran the post-flash handshake twice to be sure, and the second time he caught himself holding his breath. Sloan noticed and pretended not to notice. The clock on the wall said 5:39. Sloan stood at the back of the bay with both hands at her mouth. She had been there for 20 minutes without moving. She had watched him cable the ECU and not understood any of what she was seeing, and had understood, at the same time, exactly all of it. He turned the key. The 8-cylinder caught on the first crank. It didn't cough. It didn't hesitate. It rose into a clean, steady idle, that low, even thunder that the engineers in Maranello had spent 4 years tuning until it sounded the way a heartbeat sounds in a chest you love. Across the street, Marge was wiping down a table when she heard it. She dropped the cloth, came out the door of the diner without taking off her apron, and ran across the empty road in her sneakers. She had not run anywhere in 15 years. She did not feel her knees. Ivy woke up, blinked, saw her father's face, and started to clap. Her blanket slid off her shoulders and pooled around her on the camp chair, and she did not pick it up. She climbed down barefoot onto the cold concrete and walked over to her father and wrapped both her arms around his leg and stayed there. Holden let it run for 30 seconds, listening to the way the second cylinder bank fell into time with the first. He closed his eyes once. When he opened them, they were a little wet, but he turned his head before Sloane could see, and by the time he turned back, they were dry. Then he reached in and turned the engine off. He stood up, wiped his hands on the rag, walked the key over to Sloane, and held it out on his open palm. She didn't take it right away. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said, and for what I assumed." "I know," he answered. That was all. Then she did take the key. Her fingers brushed his palm, and neither of them pulled their hand back too quickly. Marge came up to the bay door and stood there with both hands on her chest and didn't say a word. She looked at Holden and at Sloane, and at the child holding her father's leg, and her eyes went back and forth between them like a woman trying to memorize a thing she did not want to forget. By 11 o'clock Monday morning, Sloane was back in Charlotte, in the same conference room on the 18th floor where Trent had stood 3 days earlier. The board was in their seats. Trent was in his. Sloane did not sit down. She put 3 documents on the table. The Crestline Performance Invoice Trail, 10 months of it. The forensic image of the ECU log, signature line highlighted, and a memo from outside counsel describing the federal exposure. Any single transaction over $250,000 involving falsified service records on an interstate sale crossed into wire fraud territory. Whitfield's car had crossed that line twice. There were, the memo went on to say, at least 11 other vehicles in the company's recent service history with the same suspicious flash signature. Trent did not speak. He did not need to. He stood up, set his badge on the table, and walked out without being asked. He was suspended that afternoon. The matter was referred to the FBI field office in Charlotte that Friday. By the end of the following week, a federal grand jury had issued the first round of subpoenas, and Crestline Performance had stopped answering its phones. The Whitfield car was delivered Tuesday. Whitfield drove it home and drove it for an hour, and posted, on a forum read by every serious collector east of the Mississippi, a single paragraph about a small garage in Asheville that had brought a 488 back from the dead in 48 hours when 3 certified shops had not been able to find the problem in a month. He named the garage. He named Holden. By the following Monday, Holden had 11 inquiries on his answering machine. By the Monday after that, 23. 2 of them were from collectors who flew in from out of state to shake his hand. He had to hire 2 assistants and a part-time bookkeeper, and Marge wept reading the article in the Asheville Citizen-Times and held Ivy on her lap for an hour without putting her down, and the hot chocolate in front of them went cold and neither of them drank it. The Saturday of the 3rd week, Sloane drove back. She did not take the company car. She took her own 2015 Honda Civic, the one she had bought used in graduate school and never traded in, the one her father had teased her about every Christmas for 10 years. She did not call ahead. She brought a small wooden box on the passenger seat. At the diner, she set the box on the counter in front of Marge and opened it. Inside was a brass nameplate, the kind they used to set on a secretary's desk. The engraving said Margaret L. Holloway, and underneath, the word secretary, and underneath that, a date, May 1986. With it, in a folded sheet, was a letter in a careful, sloping handwriting. Sloane read aloud the first line and the last. The first line said, "To whichever kind woman ate the cornbread with me under the maple tree." The last line said, "I am writing this while I still know your face." Marge read the rest of it standing up. She didn't make it to the end of the second paragraph. She sat down on the stool behind the register and cried for the first time in the 4 years since her husband had died, and Sloane stood quietly on the customer side of the counter with her hands folded and waited. After a while, she went around the counter, which she had no business doing in someone else's diner, and put her hand on Marge's shoulder and left it there until Marge was ready to look up. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in the 2nd week of November, The Vance Auto Works sign still said Vance Auto Works, but the front window had been wiped down to the corners, and there were 2 new mechanics in the bay and a small chalkboard out by the door that listed estimated wait times. Holden had bought a coffee pot of his own and a small kettle for tea, and a plastic basket of crayons for any kids who came in with their parent. Ivy had taken down her old drawing of the Ferrari and the sad woman and pinned up a new one. In the new drawing, the red car was the same. The thin woman with yellow hair was the same, but this time, her mouth turned up at the corners. Underneath, in Ivy's careful printing, were 5 words. She smiled. "Daddy." She did. Marge had started crossing the street twice a day instead of once. She brought biscuits in the morning and cornbread in the afternoon, and she had begun, without anyone asking her to, keeping the books for the new shop on Saturdays. She and Holden had not discussed it. It had simply happened the way a river finds a channel. The Honda Civic pulled up in front of the bay just after 3. Sloane did not get out right away. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel and watched her own breath go small and slow in the cooling air. Through the open bay door, she could see Holden bent over an engine, the late November sun coming through what was left of the maple leaves and laying gold across the back of his neck. He looked up. He saw her. He did not hurry. He wiped his hands on the rag at his belt and walked out into the sun. She got out of the Civic and walked to him. She did not embrace him. He did not embrace her. They stood about a foot apart, which is a distance some people cross in seconds and some people take years to cross, and they did not pretend otherwise. "How is your father?" he asked, because it was the only question that mattered. "He had a good morning. He recognized my mother for almost 20 minutes. He asked about the company. I told him it was fine." He smiled. Then he forgot. She paused. He didn't seem afraid this time, so that was something. Holden nodded once. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He had learned, in his own life, that sometimes "I'm sorry" was the wrong thing to put into a quiet that did not need it. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out a key on a small leather fob. She set it on the workbench through the open bay door. "My father built a garage on Tunnel Road in 1986. It's been empty since 2009. The lease is in a trust I just untangled. If you ever wanted a second location, just an option. No pressure." Holden looked at the key. He looked at her. He didn't pick it up. He didn't push it back, either. He left it where it lay, in the band of November sun coming through the bay door, and after a moment Sloane understood that not picking it up was its own kind of answer, and that the answer was not no. Ivy came running out of the side door with a folded piece of paper in her hand. She stopped in front of Sloane and held it up. Sloane took the drawing and looked at it, and looked at the new mouth Ivy had drawn for her, and crouched down on the sidewalk so she was eye level with the 7-year-old. She put her forehead against Ivy's forehead. She held it there for 3 seconds. Then she stood up. "Will you come back next Saturday?" Ivy asked. Sloane looked at Holden over the top of the child's head. Holden was watching her without watching her, the way a man watches the thing that he has decided to want, but has not yet decided to ask for. "Yes," Sloane said. "I'll come back next Saturday." She got back in the Honda. She turned the key. The 4-cylinder caught. Holden did not walk her to the door of the car. He stood in the open bay with his hand resting on the workbench, an inch from the leather fob. But when the sound of her engine rounded the curve at the top of Tunnel Road and faded into the late afternoon, he realized he had stood there watching longer than a man stands when he is only watching a car drive away.